This is being live streamed, so everybody, be aware, everybody's watching you.
No.
Nice to have you with us. Come on in, coming in.
Only then that I'm signing in for this thing that I already heard somewhere else.
Yeah, it's hard to, I had a little trouble signing in.
I thought this was like a webinar.
We decided because our speaker decided she would like to see you. Turned it into a Zoom meeting. She enjoys seeing who she's speaking to.
Yeah, she does.
You don't have to.
But there,
show
I'm not
yourself
around.
if you don't want to. But it's nice to see you all.
Oh, God. Ooh.
Who's making these comments? I can't see you. You're just commenting. Who is it? This is Evie Litwok is our speaker this evening, and going to wait a few more moments as people log in. I have troubles getting in, so yeah.
Yeah. This was still set to heat.
And we ask you to mute yourselves right now until we open up for questions. We're going to wait a few more minutes. We have a lot more people logged on than we're seeing on camera. If you want to turn on your camera or you don't, up to you. I'm going to take another couple minutes to see. We have like a lot more people who signed on. A lot of people have their cameras off for whatever reason. But we'll see. On. Nice to see those of you who have your camera on. In another few minutes. It was a beautiful day today. It was a little warm, but really nice.
Gorgeous.
So nice to have this weather. We're lucky, so lucky.
I'm just going to bring my little baby here to say hello to everybody.
Dogs are definitely part of the family. One of the saddest things I'm reading about is in Ukraine, people who are running away are leaving their pets behind because they can't. Some are bringing cats. I've heard about a lot of people bringing cats, but I think it's really hard to bring dogs when you're fleeing for your life.
I actually saw a great image though on Facebook with a woman walking across the Polish border with 2 cats in a bag and 2 dogs walking.
Yeah.
It was amazing.
Anybody who's had a dog or a cat or any close pet knows that. So I'm going to wait one more minute and we're going to start. Nice to see you all. A lot of you not showing, but that's okay. So hi, everyone. I'm Rabbi Susan Nanis. If you don't know, I'm the Director of Adult Programs at Wilshire Boulevard Temple, and this is part of our WBT Prime series of Wednesday night programs for adults on Zoom. Next week will be a priest, a rabbi, and an imam discuss. It'll be our second in a series with myself and an amazing imam, Jihad Turk, and the Reverend Neil Tadkin, who's an Episcopal priest, and we'll be talking about the views toward women, homosexuals, non-believers, and, sort of celebration and customs around life cycle events, the similarity and the differences between our belief systems, and also what authority do we give to our text? Like, does the Bible, how much authority does the Bible, the Torah, or the Quran have in each of our religions? So that will be next week at 7 o'clock. This week, we have a fascinating woman, Evie Litwok, who's actually, my sister has known her for how many years?
50 years. We went to Tel Aviv University 50 years ago.
So, and Evie is, you're going to find out, has a fascinating, I don't think it's, it's a harrowing unusual experience for a Jewish educated woman, daughter of Holocaust survivors. She was incarcerated. And she's going to talk about her experience in prison and how Judaism sustained her in many ways, and also the legacy of her beloved parents. I thought this would be appropriate or interesting because we are approaching Passover now. And it's a time when we, once again, think about what it means to be free, and particularly in light of what's going on in Ukraine, where an entire country's freedom is being threatened, that this was a very pertinent and interesting topic to discuss. So Evie, welcome. And our format will be, Evie's going to speak for about 40 minutes. And then I'm going to ask you to write your questions in the chat, and I will invite you to ask that. We can't have everybody ask, so I'll pick some questions and I'll invite you to ask your question. And the whole program will be about an hour and 15 minutes at tops. So without further ado, Evie, the screen is yours. We're going to put her in kind of like the view of the speaker view for that.
Hi, I want to thank you, Rabbi Nanis, for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor for me to be here. I am a 70-year-old formerly incarcerated Jewish lesbian and the child of 2 survivors of the Holocaust. These intersections impacted me when I was incarcerated at 2 federal women's prisons and spent time in solitary confinement. Now, some of the graphic details I'll be talking about may be triggering. My parents were Holocaust survivors. My mother was a teenager when she entered Auschwitz. My father, also a teenager, was in 12 labor and concentration camps. I grew up through the lens of the Holocaust. For me, it was not a historical event that ended in May 1945 when my parents were liberated, but a living, fluid experience which influenced my way of thinking and my view of the world. In 2009 and 10, I was living with my mother, who had great difficulty hearing, seeing, and walking without support. But she insisted on being at my sentencing hearing and speaking to the judge on my behalf. And the trip for her one way was 3 to 5 hours, which was very difficult. But she came, she stood up, and she said to the judge, "Your Honor, I'm a Holocaust survivor. I have suffered enough for a lifetime. My daughter, she has been a fantastic daughter. Without her, I cannot exist. She does everything for me. She feeds me, she shops. And as far as my daughter is concerned, without her, I cannot exist, not even for a day. I will die without her." The Jewish judge responded by saying, "Too bad, I'm sending her to prison." When we got home, I had to pack things away prior to my incarceration. And my mother walked into the room, and leaning against her walker, she motioned for me to move closer to her. She said, "It will be harder for you to be in prison than it was for me to be in concentration camp." I said, "Mom, are you crazy? You were in Auschwitz. How can you possibly compare the two?" She said, "I was 12 years old. You are 60. And it would be years later, when I was placed in solitary confinement, that my mother's words would come back to me. I was young, a child. I didn't know what was going on. You're an old woman, aware of what you lost. You will see your life every day." And she was right. The moment I entered prison, I knew I was no longer in the free world. I arrived at a federal prison in West Virginia in 2010, was taken by an officer into a cold, old, dingy room, was told to strip naked in front of the officer, was ordered to pee in front of her, was asked to lift my breasts so she could check for contraband, and then was told to bend over and cough so she could check that I had no drugs or paraphernalia in more personal areas. And at that moment, when I was bent over, I was more humiliated than at any other time in my life. And I knew immediately that I had to emotionally shut down in order to survive. I knew I couldn't reveal any thoughts or feelings or respond to anything, even though I wanted to scream and cry at the same time. I had to immediately find a set of coping skills that didn't exist prior to that moment. I was assigned to sleep in an orientation unit where most what they call newbies stay during the first 2 weeks of prison. And some of the veterans approached me and said, if you want to do easy time, you need to stay under the radar. Officers shouldn't know your name. The warden shouldn't know your name. Well, I was a baby of the women's, gay rights, and civil rights movement. I was an old, experienced activist, and I didn't and couldn't check my activism at the door. It took less than an hour for me to be on everybody's radar. So everybody walks over to you. They ask, are you married? Do you have kids? And you're allowed to bring 25 pictures into prison. So the first person said, are you married? Do you have kids? I said, no, I'm not married. I don't have kids. Second person, are you married? Do you have kids? I said, no, I'm not married. I don't have kids. After the fourth woman asked me, I thought, my God, I came out to my mother 40 years ago. I'm not going back in the closet. And when I did come out to my very, very progressive mother in my early 20s, she went Anatevka on me and said, if Hitler didn't kill me, you will, which at the time and still today, I think is a very funny line. She also spit on the floor and said, all the Kohanim are rolling in their graves. My mother believed herself to be a double Kohen because her grandfathers were brothers and both Kohens. So I was very impressed prior to that she knew when one person was rolling in their grave, but to know that all these Kohanim were simultaneously rolling was extremely impressive. So when the next woman approached me and asked me if I was married and I had kids, I said, I'm not married, I don't have kids, and I'm a lesbian. She said, can I see your pictures? And I had brought in 25 pictures of my dog, Allie. So she screamed to the entire unit, this old white lesbian has 25 pictures of her dog. Well, it took less than an hour through the new school version of telephone, inmate.com, for everybody on the compound, all 1,300 women, every guard and every warden, to know that in fact, I had come out. And within an hour, I was on everybody's radar. And this turned out to be very dangerous for me. And I did not do easy time, not even for one day being in there. So within a week, the unit manager called me into her office and I had no idea why. And she opened by saying, I understand you're an open lesbian, and I could feel myself getting angry. I said, yes, and I'm an open Jew and an open feminist. She continued, several women have claimed that you've been touching their buttocks. And it took me a minute to figure out that a buttocks was a tushy. But as soon as she said that, I forgot I was in prison. I practically jumped across her desk and I was furious. How dare you accuse me? I don't touch anybody. I demanded she bring my accusers in the room, and I was ready to go to court when I realized I was in prison. And by the time I left her office and walked to my bed, I had been moved to another unit called the ghetto and my bed was in an area called the bus stop. And this was 10 days into my prison sentence. And while the first unit I was in was very quiet, the ghetto was noisy. There are 120 women in the sleeping unit, and the bus where I'm sitting is where the bus stop is. And so in prison, all the ceilings are fluorescent lights. They're not just one light, they're completely fluorescent lights throughout. And at 11 o'clock, if you're behind me in the sleeping quarters, all the lights are off and it's actually dark. But for the 10 double bunk, approximately 20 of us that were punished, but to be on this bus stop, we were literally under fluorescent lights. And right in front of us was an ice machine, which came crashing down every 20 minutes. And to the side of us were the bathrooms where 120 women were flushing toilets or taking showers or just hanging out all night. There was no way to sleep, and that was the point. And I was kept on the bus stop for most of the time I was in prison. And I was told it was punishment for basically coming out as a lesbian. Now, prior to my incarceration, I had not attended religious services for 45 years. I went to prison when I was 60. From the time of my brother's bar mitzvah, I went for high holidays. But on day one of prison, I wanted a siddur, a prayer book. I got one from another Jewish prisoner, and I held on to it while no one was looking. And I found myself repeating one Jewish prayer over and over again. I shut my eyes and would say, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And each day I would say those words hundreds and hundreds of times. It was comforting for me. I also ended up going to weekly services in prison. And since my time in prison, I don't miss services. I go every week and I participate actively in congregations. And I wondered why I started to say the Shema and going to services. And the first image that came to mind was that of my father. When I was young, Shabbat was a time for stories, mostly me asking my father and mother about the family I never met. I had 5 important people in my life who survived the Holocaust: my mother, my father, my mother's sister, and my father's parents, my grandparents. They were the influences in my life, but I wanted to know about the 70 people who perished on my mother's side and the 55 people who perished on my father's side. So they would tell me stories, but there was one story I did not hear as a child. I ended up hearing it in the late 1980s. What happened was my parents' friends started to get successful and buy apartments in Florida to go to in the winter. And I knew my parents would never spend their money on themselves. So I bought them an apartment for us to stay in Boca. And that's where I heard this story. Jews in Poland in 1939, it was illegal for a Jewish person to carry a siddur, a talis, and a tefillin. In fact, if you were caught with those items, you could be shot. For some reason, my father decided to take his velvet pouch containing his siddur, his talis, and tefillin to work. He was stopped by a Nazi on horseback. The Nazi called over other Jews to watch what happened to a Jew who didn't obey the law. He beat my father to within an inch of his life. And after he left, a young Jewish doctor came over and tried to help. The Jewish doctor said, "I've done all I can. The rest is in God's hands." And my father, when everybody left, looked up to God and said, "If you save me, I will honor you by praying every day." And he survived and he kept his promise. And I grew up watching him as a child find a corner to pray in, and he would smile when he'd see me watching him start his prayers. And as he put the leather on his arms, I stuck my arm out so he could bond our arms together. And my memory of his joy davening stayed with me my whole life. And it was this joy that gave me what I needed to survive in prison. And I heard, and this is the story that I heard on that, on a trip we made for New Year's in about 1988. And then during that weekend, my parents went to a New Year's party for survivors. There were 2 rooms of 200 people with 10 people at a table. A woman came over and introduced herself as Mrs. Schindel, the hostess, and told the people who were sitting with my mother that her husband, Dr. Schindel, was in the other room. And a few minutes later, there was crying and screaming, and everybody went to the other room to see what was going on. My mother saw my father on his knees, holding an older Jewish man who was partially paralyzed. It was the Jewish doctor who 45 years earlier said, "I've done all I can, and the rest is in God's hands." And it's this story that I remember that touched me deeply, that I really believed was part of how I was connected. Now, all women are forced to work in prison. Most older women like me are given indoor jobs where they could sit after they finish their work. I was ordered, again, because I came out, I was not given a job normally given to older people. And I was told that this was intentional, that they were angry that I had come out. And so they ordered me to sweep rocks off the big rocks off of the streets with a broom. And it's very hard to sweep a rock off the street. We're not talking about a pebble. And the first day that I was ordered, and it was 100 degrees in the mountains of West Virginia, and they knew I had a heart condition, and they knew that on both sides of my family there was heart disease, but they still made me do this. And as I started to sweep, a memory of a story my mother told me came to mind. I had never met my mother's father, my grandfather. She described him as a tall, handsome man with jet black hair and jet black beard. And after the Germans came to Poland in 1939, they rounded up the religious men and the business leaders and took them away for 3 weeks, and they were beaten relentlessly. When they were brought home, my mother was frightened when she saw her tall, black-haired father being completely gray and permanently bent over from the beatings. And to further humiliate the men, the Nazis made the men sweep the streets in front of their wives and children. And as I started to sweep the streets of prison the first day and every day, I could feel my grandfather, who I never met, sweeping besides me. The one area prisoners get to make their choice is religious affiliation. You can be any religion, and you could change every week. I went to Friday night services. There were only 10 women who attended, and only half were Jewish. And 6 weeks before the holiday of Passover, Jewish women and the women who identified as Jewish got a list of kosher for Passover foods that they were allowed to buy. The list included chocolate macaroons, chocolate covered matzah, and food you don't get on a prison compound. So of course, there was a bunch of women as soon as I got the list that were saying, I want in on this. I want some of that chocolate stuff. However, 6 weeks before we got the list, 35 women converted to be Jewish so that they could buy from the list. The other reason women converted is that we had 2 nights of 5 hours each night to go through the service without officers. That meant 5 hours away from hell for 2 nights. And there were 2 of us who knew the service and spoke Hebrew. So my friend Marika said, why don't you say the Manashtana? And I said it and I sang it. And afterwards, everybody started clapping. And I looked at her, I said, you know, they don't know this is a service. They think it's a Broadway show or something. And then, of course, Passover was over, Ramadan came, and everybody converted to Muslim. And that's how it would go. Now, in both prisons that I was at, medical care was essentially non-existent. Women with serious conditions were not set out for scans or MRI. If you got cancer in prison, even if it was caught early, it's a death sentence. We had 1 physician's assistant who saw all 1,300 women. And whether you came with a headache, a broken foot, cancer, or a cyst, he gave the same speech. You're fat, walk on the track, and drink water. A woman named Miriam Hernandez went in to see him for severe stomach pain. It was clear she was in trouble. He gave her the fat speech, sent her back to the unit, and 2 weeks later, she died when her gallbladder burst. And I was so upset, I wrote a story about the officer's failure to do a simple blood test. I blamed him for her unnecessary death. And instead of snail mailing the piece, which I usually did, I sent it in an email, which officers read. And an hour after it was posted to my website, I was arrested, shackled, and sent to solitary. I was told that I'd be there until they felt like letting me out because I had written about an officer. Solitary confinement is a prison within a prison run by a few people who do whatever they want. They answer to no one. And the primary reason in women's prisons that the solitary unit, which is sometimes called the SHU, was filled is generally guards and officers' retaliation. And unfortunately, what goes on in women's prisons, and I can only speak to what goes on in women's prisons, is a tremendous amount of sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. So if an officer wanted to have sex with someone, he'd approach a young mother. And in 70% of the women in prison are mothers. So the officer would walk over and say, do you want to see your kids? And they would look at him like, and he would say, if you want to see your kids, Forgive me for saying this, but what he said is, then I want a blowjob. And it was open. I heard it with my own ears. Now, if the woman did not do it, she was sent to solitary and lost her visiting privileges. If she did do it, then she'd have to keep doing it every day. And if the officer got nervous that she was going to report him, he would arrange to have her transferred. So if you're a poor person and your kids are in Florida and they struggle to save up to meet you every week or every month, what an officer can do is move you to California, move you to another federal prison in Wisconsin, and then you'll never see your kids. And it's done all the time. Now, I was kept in solitary for 7 weeks, and it was a month past my release date. I have never physically, mentally, or emotionally recovered from the experience. You're strip searched, you're given a t-shirt, shorts, underwear, and a jumpsuit. You get a thin blanket. You wear all of your clothes all the time because the temperature is kept at about 55 degrees. And being older and anemic, I was freezing. And when you ask for a second blanket, you're denied. Now, for you to get a sense of what solitary is like, I want you to envision yourself being locked into your bathroom. There's no window. Where your tub is a metal bed. You have a tiny sink, a toilet, and a metal bed. And all you can do is sit on the toilet, sit on the metal bed, or stand. You do not have a laptop. You do not have a telephone. You do not have a book. You have no knitting to do. You have no crossword puzzle to do. And the question is, and I usually ask for a show of hands, but I won't do it now, how many people really think they could sit in their bathroom with nothing to do for 24 hours? Because you have to understand solitary is to, and try sitting in your bathroom for 20 minutes and see if you can do it even that long. Because what happens is you want to get out of there, you're locked in, and your mind has no place to go. The moment I got into solitary, my blood pressure was high. I don't know that for a fact. I only know that from my feelings. But I developed vertigo, which I had never had, and migraines from the fluorescent lights. And I begged them for weeks to take my blood pressure because I was very concerned about how I was feeling. And they refused me medical care. And after 2 weeks, they took my blood pressure. It was 200 over 100. I asked to go to the hospital, and the medical assistant laughed. He said, "We get 75,000 if you die. So no, you're not going anywhere." Now that may or may not be true because there's a lot of lying in prison, but that's the attitude. You're given one roll of toilet paper, and remember, you're locked in a room. You're not going anywhere. So when you run out, when I ran out and asked for a second roll, the guard looked at me with a straight face and said, "Wipe yourself." And I stared right back at him, having no intention of giving him the satisfaction that he in any way was upsetting me, even though that was deeply upsetting. They give you your food, your toilet paper, when they give it to you. And when they know a woman has her period, they intentionally don't give them enough pads. And you're sitting in solitary, and it is a hollow space, and it's cement walls. And 60 women are screaming, not simultaneously, but 24 hours a day, "Get me the F out of here." And in my head, it's been 8 years. I was released in 2014. I can still hear those screams. And I cannot be in a room that's loud. I cannot even play my TV loud because it brings back the memories of the women screaming, "Get me out of here." And the solitary confinement, you're right next to each other, and you hear women trying to commit suicide. You even hear when some succeed. I didn't want to kill myself, but I looked up at God and I said, "I've had a great life, and it would be really okay with me if I didn't wake up." I didn't want to do it, but I really had had enough by this point. I didn't know what day or time it was. Because there's a window that boards you up, And solitary was very difficult for me. And I still, again, 8 years later, am very triggered by the experience. But I heard a chaplain call my name, and I had no idea why. I didn't really know the chaplain. But at Friday night services, we would get challah or matzah and grape juice. And I saw the chaplain put something in the food slot where the guards passed us our food. It was 3 pieces of matzah and grape juice. And in that moment, I realized it was Friday night. I started to sob and couldn't stop, but I also knew I couldn't let them see me cry. So I put my face down, grabbed the items, laid them on the tiny desk, made the traditional prayers. I remembered who I was, and I knew I had the strength to survive, just like my mother did. I was released shortly after my time in solitary, and I can tell you that coming home was worse than being in prison. I was one of the 700,000 people being released from confinement each year. I was put on a Greyhound bus, given $30, and sent back to New York. I arrived at Port Authority to no one. My mother was not in condition to help me, and I had no relationship with my brother. I was homeless and penniless for 16 months. I went to nonprofits serving formerly incarcerated people. They offered me a resume, 2-week employment training, and 3 job interviews. The job bank had only construction or food service jobs, most of which were inappropriate for me given I am disabled due to my back. And I couldn't stand for 8 hours, without being crippled. I had a 30-year work history with 12 years on Wall Street, 10 years in nonprofit, and I could not even get an entry-level job. I sent out 200 job applications, heard from no one. I understood poverty for the first time. I had to choose on a daily basis whether to eat a 30-cent bagel or a $1 slice of pizza. I didn't want to eat that way, but that was all I could afford. And after being homeless for 16 months, I happened to run into an old friend that I knew from back in the 1970s. And when she found out that I was homeless, she said, "You can't stay like this." She took me to the place I live now, which is senior low-income housing. There was a tiny studio apartment. She said, "You have to, you will not stabilize unless you have housing." And I had not stabilized for the 16 months that I was homeless. I was in very bad shape. And I'm not someone who's a suicidal person, and I'm happen to be very optimistic. But after 16 months of sleeping in shelters in very dangerous situations, you start to lose a lot of hope. I said to her, if I take this apartment, then the only money I have, which is Social Security, would go to rent and I would have no money to live on. And she said, let's stabilize you and let's get you in. I did take her advice, and housing did stabilize me. The minute I turned the key to lock the door, lock myself into my apartment, even though I had no furniture, it was the first time in decades I felt safe and I felt free. And I don't think I could have survived another 6 months had I not found this housing. Now, I never got a job, and she knew this, and she came to me, said, "I know you're prideful, but I'm going to give you $1,000 a month for a year. That'll allow you to pay your bills and start your organization, Witness to Mass Incarceration." And it did stabilize me. I did start the business. I did start testifying and speaking in front of audience. And her money for that 1 year gave me the safety net I needed to restart my life, keep my life. And what I understood from this was it took one person to help me survive. And most formerly incarcerated people leaving prison leave without the ability to earn an income. They don't come home to a family business or any kind of wealth. We come home to correctional control, surveillance, and significant personal and community barriers. I formed Witness to Mass Incarceration to place the voices of formerly incarcerated women and LGBTQ people at the front of the movement to end mass incarceration and to create initiatives to help them. I also formed it because reentry now and for the last 30 years has largely focused on providing transactional solutions, getting a meal, a resume, employment training. But cobbling these things together does not allow you to rebuild a life. In fact, hundreds of millions of dollars have gone into reentry every year for the past 30 years in every city across the United States. And despite these services, there has not been a reduction in recidivism, nor has there been significant long-term housing or employment solutions. Put simply, the model that's been used for the last 30 years does not work. Or, as we say in prison, it's not broken. It's working exactly as it's supposed to, meaning sustaining the status quo and keeping us in transitional housing and marginalized. Witness is committed to transformational change and ensuring long-term solutions. Our initiatives and special projects are informed, quite honestly, by my experience and the experience of my parents and my Aunt Bronca and my grandparents. The suitcase project came out of my parents' experience of getting $2.50 and a suitcase from Hyatt before they got on the boat to come to the United States. When I came home to no one, I wanted to ensure that people being released are met by someone, taken out for their first free world meal, and provide them with a suitcase that had a phone with minutes for a year, a computer, and $800 worth of gift certificates, which don't go very far. It's for food, transportation, clothing, and toiletries. The digital library I have are comprised of 50 interviews. This is informed by my parents and their friends having testified at the Shoah Institute about life before, during, and after the Holocaust. For me, their testimony was critical to ensuring that people would never forget the Holocaust. And in my very small way, my library, my little library, exists to make people aware of mass incarceration and its impact. We also focus on eliminating sexual violence in confinement because there's no Me Too movement behind bars. Through a grant funded by the Department of Justice PRIA Resource Center, we convened a group of women and then LGBT survivors of sexual violence. I wrote a report which is published on their website that says, despite the passage of the Prison Rape Elimination Act, this was a congressional act passed because of the sexual violence in prison in 2003. They criminalized sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. 19 years later, we are still experiencing sexual violence in prison because the act, the standards, and the monitoring of the prisons have not deterred the sexual violence. And today, literally in California at FCI Dublin, a women's federal prison, the level of sexual violence has become so extreme that government agencies are being forced to look at this. And this is 19 years after the passage of a law. Our most significant work is the MAP project. I knew that if I couldn't get a job with 30 years of a work history, that the women I was in prison with who were much younger than I was and had no job history would never be able to get a job. There are so many barriers. Additionally, prior to COVID, the rate of unemployment for formerly incarcerated people was 27%, with Black women being at 43%. Out of necessity, passion, and an urgency to rebuild lives, thousands of formerly incarcerated people across the country have started their own services and businesses. And these are all micro businesses, 1 or 2 people. There are some that break through, but most don't. I realized the businesses were lacking resources. So the MAP was designed to build a movement to economically empower formerly incarcerated people. It's a multi-year effort to build an economic ecosystem. And we began by having a first of its kind directory of formerly incarcerated led services and businesses. Since building the platform, we've identified 700 services and businesses, created profiles, done interviews, wrote articles, and pushed out social media. We hope to build an incubator fund so we can help people move further along in their process, but most of us do not have the financial resources. What I want to tell you is formerly incarcerated people are not sitting around thinking about which bank to rob next. They want to jumpstart their lives and make up for lost time. Yes, there are a handful that will go back and commit a crime, but you don't hear about the 95% that don't go back and don't commit crimes. You only tend to hear about the crimes that are committed by a handful. A report by the Association for Enterprise Opportunities revealed that Black business owners have a median net worth that is 12 times that of Black wage owners. However, Black business owners only earn 1/10 the income of white business owners. Just to understand further about small business, white men own 2.8 million small businesses, while Black women own 41,250. That's your wealth inequality stats, but without including formerly incarcerated people. So we are trying to focus on building wealth for our community and building generational wealth for a population who never had the chance to have it. We're trying to make transformational change. And being 70 years old, not only am I passionate about doing this work and making a difference, but I'm committed to breaking the back of a system that does little to do anything. To do little to make being released from prison anything short of a life sentence. I'll mention one more thing that we just did recently, which is on January 27th, I was at a meeting with the Faith-Based Coalition, and I'm sure many of you know that we have a prison in New York that is called Rikers Island that you hear a lot about. And on that day, we heard about violence in the prison. And I looked at the people in the room and I said to them that the people in Rikers, it was 0 degrees in New York, are freezing, they're starving, and they're not getting medication because there's nobody walking around giving 5,600 people their medication. So that means insulin, heart, cancer meds, and even more importantly, psychotropic meds for people who need to take it are not being given. And if you were sitting in Rikers, locked in a cell, freezing, hungry, and without your medication, you might get violent too. I made a suggestion at that meeting that we provide hats and gloves for people, and that we try to do something to keep them warm. And nobody responded. And instead, somebody made an alternate suggestion, which was, why don't we use this weekend to have our synagogues, churches, and mosques have a moment of silence for Rikers? And I practically went through the Zoom window and said, are you kidding me? How is a moment of silence going to help them? It may ease your conscience, but it doesn't do anything for them. And in that moment, when I heard him say that, I decided to build a campaign to raise money for hats and gloves. And on March 17th, myself and 6 wonderful interns had raised $45,000 to provide 5,600 people in Rikers with hats and gloves. However, they still haven't given it to them. We're waiting. We have to commit to taking care of people who are marginalized in so many ways. I try to do this work to honor the 5 members of my family, my parents, Genya and Ziggy, my Aunt Brunka, and my grandparents, Erna and Natan, by doing the work that I believe would make them proud of me. I also do the work for those who perished and everybody who is perishing today in Ukraine. I think we need to do direct service. I think we need to help people. I'm now going to introduce you to the 2 families I love. My family of origin. I'm going to show you a 2-minute video with some pictures, and my Maltese family, which helps me to survive every day. And I thank you for listening. And after this film, I'll take your questions. I don't hear you.
No, I can hear, I hope.
Oh, yes. Thank you. That was so moving and so powerful and so interesting. And I'm wondering if people have questions, you can write them into the chat. I'm seeing if anyone has any questions or anything they would like to, while I don't see anything yet, but while I'm waiting. You talked about the trauma in prison, but what about the trauma and the aftermath when you come out of prison? What kind of scars do you carry with you into your life?
So what I will tell you without exception is that nobody walks out of prison without trauma and without a lot of damage. And when I first came out and I got into an elevator that was not crowded, about a few minutes later, about 100 people came into the elevator and I had a panic attack, which I had never had in my life, and stopped breathing. And I believe that's a direct consequence of having been in solitary confinement. And it kept happening to me when I would walk into a subway and I realized I can't go into enclosed places. And I went to see my doctor and she said, these panic attacks with you stopping breathing will lead to a stroke. So is there any way that you can know in advance? And I said, no, I have no idea. Now, my doctor knew I had a friend, this little creature. This is Allie, who the last picture was of her sitting at services. And she said, take Allie and see if that distracts you or helps you. And I started to take Allie in a bag everywhere. And Allie intuitively started to kiss me when she felt I was nervous, because she's like that. And so the doctor wrote a note basically to New York City saying, I have to go everywhere with this dog or I won't, or I could have a stroke. And that's just me. And that's just one incident. But if you put 100 survivors of prison in a room, you will hear a number of things. When they see a police person on the street, they think they're coming for them. No matter how long they've been out of prison, whether it's a day or 8 years or 30 years. When they hear in prison, guards have a lot of keys. So the clanging of keychains is a familiar sound in prison. When you hear keychains or anything clanging outside, you turn around like it takes you right back to prison. Prison is a physically dangerous place. If someone doesn't like you or if someone's in a bad mood, they can hit you. So inside prison, at one point, they put me in a cell with a woman who was a very large woman who hated, quote, homos. And when I went to sleep, she had a lock in her hand and she said, Mama, if you go to sleep, I'll kill you. So I never went to sleep I stayed up all night and I would try to sleep a little during the day. But because of that and so many other experiences, I still today, 8 years after the fact, and nobody knows this. If you talk to me and we have lunch, you will think I'm normal, but I'm telling you, I'm not. In fact, your sister took me to the theater once, and we had great seats in the middle, like 6 rows back. And I looked at her and I said, Sash, I can't sit here. I can only sit on an aisle and I can only sit near a door. And in my own synagogue, I sit close to the door because I need to have an escape route. It's just very tough. And so if you put us in a room, you'll hear the same kinds of conversations. You can never get it out of your head. And you're always aware of your surroundings.
So here's a question, Leonie, were you surprised by how bad it was in prison?
I had no idea what it would be. I again, I come from a white privileged family. Even though my parents came here with no money, they I was part of a culture. I knew that I was going to have a successful life. I knew I was going to go to college. I knew that I was on a certain path. It never dawned on me that I would end up in prison. However, for most of the other people that I was incarcerated with, they come from neighborhoods where they expected to go to prison, and they knew more about the experience than I ever would. Sadly, and I think what needs to be understood, and I think this is very important that people understand, that while my family business was construction, their family business was dealing drugs. We have decided that they're bad and we're good, but the truth is, most of the people I was in prison with grew up in a way where their family business was this, which happens to be illegal. And if you understand that, you understand why not to blame them for what they did.
So we have a question. Why were you sent to prison?
So I'm happy to answer that, but I'm going to tell you that that's the one question you should never ask. And the reason I will tell you that is because you will only remember me by my worst experience or by what I did wrong. And mine was a financial crime, but I stand with the people who also committed violent crimes. And there's two things. We don't want to be, if I tell you what I did, there's the person that committed that murder. And if I look in your life and ask you, if I can ask you what's the worst thing you've ever done, and do you want to be defined by that, your answer would be no. So for the sake of not boxing someone in, I try to tell people not to ask the question.
So you're just saying it was a financial crime.
Yeah, I mean, what difference does it make? It's done.
Right, but it wasn't a violent crime.
But even if it was, but I have to tell you something about violent crime. Particularly in low-income areas, when you have a violent crime, let's say you have 15 teenagers in a room and between the ages of 14 and 18, and one person commits a murder, there is something called felony murder, which means that every person in that room, most of whom never knew there was a gun, most of whom had nothing to do with the murder, are all given violent crime, are all considered violent criminals, are all convicted of felony murder, and all go to prison for the same amount of time. Now, if there was felony tax evasion for corporations, then you'd see prisons change. You're only seeing felony murder because it happens in certain neighborhoods. But I assure you, felony tax evasions and other white collar crimes would pick up a lot of people, but they don't do that. So there are an awful lot of people in prison who were literally just in a room and lost 20 to 30 years of their life because at 17 years old, they were at a party where somebody was murdered.
Somebody's asking, are you in Los Angeles? No, she's in New York City. I just wanted to answer that. Sorry, keep going.
But I do, prior to COVID, to be honest, I went at least 4 times a year because there's a lot of people I work with out there.
Here's a question. How many years were you sentenced to, and how many years did you serve? And why were you sent to a federal prison, not a federal camp, if it were a financial crime?
Well, I was sent to a federal camp first. And then the second time I was sent to a medium security. There's not necessarily, the camp, by the way, was worse than being behind barbed wires. And I will give you an example of, because you got to understand something. Once, especially with federal crimes, they answer to nobody. In state prisons or in county jails, you can bring a TV crew in and you can interview people and you can bring cameras. You can't. Federal crimes, they use the Patriot Act to keep everybody out and to do whatever they want to do. But I was at Alderson, which is where Martha Stewart was, and I wrote an article that it was not a cupcake camp. It was stricter than the medium security barbed wire prison, which I was in. I was convicted to 2 years. My conviction was overturned by the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. I had 4 counts, 3 counts of tax evasion, 1 count of mail fraud, 2 counts were overturned. The mail fraud was dismissed, and there was 1 count remaining. But I did not commit tax evasion, so I would not plead guilty. And just to understand how much they hate to go to trial, I was arrested in 1997. They didn't take me to trial for 12 years because the case wasn't good. And when I did go to trial, they waited till there was absolutely no money in my bank account. And I was forced to use their public defender instead of, let's say, a paid attorney. And what they do is they bring you in every week and they threaten you. So they would bring me in and say, if you don't plead guilty, we're going to send you to prison. It's Thanksgiving, and by Christmas, you'll be raped. But what they do most of the time, and where they get people to plead guilty most of the time, is by threatening to put your child in prison. So this is, and what they did with me, I had no children, I had no partner, I just have my dogs. And what they did to me is they said, if you don't plead guilty, we're going to arrest your parents. Now that did scare me. I didn't tell them it scared me, but I had to go home and tell my parents that they were going to be pursued, and they were pursued. And my parents had to spend a lot of money to show them that my finances had nothing to do with theirs. But where they get Black women to plead guilty, and I say Black women because they're targeted this way, is I had a friend in prison named Lisa, who was not in the city where the crime, she was accused of stealing money from an ATM machine in a certain city. She wasn't in the city. She wasn't even in the state. It was a crime that was 9:45 in the evening in a certain city. And she was going to go to trial, but they came to her and they said, your daughter's starting law school next week. We're going to ruin your daughter's life. We're going to walk in and arrest her the first day she enters law school, and that'll be it for her if you don't plead guilty. And Lisa said, I plead guilty. That is how I didn't meet one woman who told me this. I am out of 1,300 women, if 200 were seriously guilty, I'd be surprised. I'm telling you that 1,100 women are there for no reason whatsoever. Lisa she's not just a rogue situation that if you're sitting in your car and you have a boyfriend who's a drug dealer and you're just sitting there because you're too dumb, you're being dumb, and they arrest the boyfriend, they want to charge the boyfriend with 45 to life. But they walk over to the boyfriend and say, if you give us 20 people, we'll take 20 years off your sentence. They guarantee him 25 years in prison, and he gives the girlfriend and everybody he knows up. And all of a sudden, this young girl who was dumb enough to sit in the car with him is now facing 10 to 20 years in prison on a charge that only exists in America called conspiracy. And she has to plead guilty because they're going to take the boyfriend and another friend who's facing 45 years. And those two people who really did commit a crime are going to be the witnesses against this girl, and she's going to get life for being in a car. So if you didn't, I read everybody's stories. I listened to everybody's stories, but I read the documents. I had nothing to do but to read these cases every single day. And I met with people, and I had no idea how corrupt it was, not whatsoever. So many people are in prison, particularly women, for absolutely no reason, which is shocking to me. Oh, and just to tell you, I was in, when I was in West Virginia, so it's freezing in the winter and it's hot as hell in the summer because you're in the mountains. And so this is a camp, and you would think it would be easier if you rolled up your sleeve because it's 100 degrees, or rolled up your pants because you're schwitzing. An officer would walk over to you and say, and put you in solitary, and say, and the charge would be that by rolling your sleeves up and your pants up, you try to sexually induce this officer in some way. So you've got 16 women sitting in solitary confinement for rolling sleeves up with an accusation that's bogus. So that's a camp. If you had vitamins that you bought, it's not medical, just vitamins. And if they come in very often, and this happened in the camp. It's not an inspection. They want to come in and see if you have contraband in your lockers, so they have everybody go outside. This happened all the time, these inspections. And they only did the inspections when it was pouring or snowing or hot as hell. They never did the inspection when it was a cool day. So as an older person in prison, you were terrified to get a cold. You were terrified it would turn into pneumonia because there's no medical care. And yet they would have you stand while they're searching. So in your locker, if they take your vitamins, and let's say it's the 15th of the month, and you haven't taken your vitamins that you chose to buy, if they see that there's 20 there and they feel it should only be 15 pills, you get thrown into solitary. They make up their own rules, and there's nobody to stop them. I just raised $45,000 in 6 weeks and purchased 5,600 sets of hats and gloves. They were delivered, and to tell you the truth, I'm worried they won't be given out, because in prison they do what they feel like doing, and nobody has them. There's no way to control correctional officers or wardens or anybody, whether it's a camp or maximum.
So this is going to be our last question. And thank you so much. I think it's very illuminating, very upsetting. It makes me want to adopt some women in prison and start, visiting them. Or I do have one rabbi friend who has been visiting women in prison for 20 years. Not only has she been visiting them, but 2 of them, one got out after 28 years or 30 years. She attacked, I don't know if she killed her husband, who had been beating her and threatening her life. It was self-defense, but she was convicted. She brought her into her home, and the woman lived with her for 2 years to help her get on her feet. And I see why that's necessary now after your story.
Oh, and I'll tell you something, almost every woman, we try to collect $2,000 for a suitcase, because if you don't have a phone, you can't communicate. If you don't have a computer, you can't look for a job. So, but when people come out of prison, they're in a fog, and every one of them has broken their phone or lost their phone. And of course we get insurance because we know this. And it's not because they come from a world where you are woken up very rudely at 6:30 a.m. and every minute of your day is controlled. You move here at this hour, you do laundry at 10 minutes to 7, you have breakfast from 7 to 7:10. So you go from a world that's completely structured to one that's completely, I don't know what to do with myself, because there's no structure. So there's, in addition to the damage you come out with, there's a fog. So the first year is a tough year because you got to get used to an environment that you don't recognize.
So do you feel threatened by authorities today? The authorities or the government or authority?
Oh, I'm fearless. I will say this in all honesty, I'm 70 years old and I don't give a shit. But I can say that because I'm a white woman. I can say that for certain reasons. Right. And I will do whatever it takes to break this system for every day of my life as long as I live.
I really applaud you and thank you. I
also want to say, please ask people to go to my website and subscribe to the newsletter. We only send one out every 2 weeks, but it's witnesstomassincarceration.org. And I would love people to subscribe.
Okay. Were the guards monsters beforehand, or did the system turn them into monsters?
Could a system turn you into a monster?
No.
Right. So that's the answer to the question.
And
If it's not, you have to be predisposed. So in prison, people would make fun of me. I had a bunch, I had the people that protected me were Black women. I was older. They refused to call me Evie. They would only call me Miss Evie, or I had to get them to call me Miss Evie instead of Miss Litwok out of respect for my age. And they really protected me. But what was the question? Because I just lost my train of thought.
the guards were monsters, or
No, all right.
were the guards monsters beforehand? Could you be a monster, or who?
Well, I think that you have to be predisposed. But on the other hand, when the truth is that there's a lot of research that shows when you break up two groups and you make one Nazis and one Jews, or when you break up groups and you put one person in power and one person not in power, there's a level of cruelty that comes out, even if it's not prison. So were they predisposed? Yes. But I do think more people that in your environment, in our environment, could be as cruel as anybody I was incarcerated with as a guard.
I'm sure you're right.
You know?
I want to thank you.
I know what I was going to say.
Go ahead.
So I'm surrounded by Black women taking care of me. And they said, Miss Evie, you going to fight if someone hits you? I said, no way. And they said, you have to fight if someone hits you. I said, I'm not fighting. I said, if I pick up, first of all, I'm not strong. Second of all, I'm 5 feet and if somebody's going to hit me, I'll be knocked out on the first punch anyway. And they were shocked that I wouldn't fight back. And so when you say were the guards monsters, I'm not predisposed to fight. So I wouldn't be predisposed to do that. So, and there are some women in prison that have had to spend their life fighting for their territory. So people will be protective and overreact. So if you have a guard who's a monster and somebody who's a quick draw, you have a fight.
Was there a lot of violence in the prison?
Well, a lot is a relative word. There's a lot of people that would hurt you. It's an environment designed to be punitive. It's environment designed. They would love guards in men's prisons to let men fight. They'll put a gay, skinny guy in with a big guy and know exactly what's going to happen. One of two things: he'll be raped or he'll be dead. So it is very, very, there's so much that guards do to encourage the violence or to encourage the fighting. And you have a lot of fighting in men's prisons because the guards let it happen. They want it to happen. They like having these gangs fight with each other. But remember something, there's a lot of drugs in prison. There's a lot of stuff in prison. It doesn't come there from visitors. It comes there from guards. So they're a big problem.
Our time is up. I really want to thank you. And you are such a heroic woman, and what you're doing is so important. Please tell us your website again.
It's witness, the word witness, TOMASS, the word incarceration.org.
Thank you, Evie, so much. And thank you for opening our eyes, and thank you for all the amazing work you're doing. And hopefully we can support you as much as we can.
Thank you. I'm honored to have spoken. And thank you all for coming.
Good night, everyone. Thank you so much. I think it was a really meaningful talk, and I think we all learned a lot and have a lot to think about what we're going to do in response to this call to action.
And I'd be happy to help you with that.
Thank you all so much. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.